Think back. Think back about Jesus and the encounters people had with him. With the exception of a few planned gatherings and events with him, most people met Jesus in some very ordinary places. When they hadn't intentionally gone there to see him. A dusty road to Emmaus, with travelers just before supper time. At a wedding, in the back room with the servants who are running out of wine. In the temple, at a money-changing table where Jesus stands fuming with anger whip in hand because you've been money gouging people who are just trying to go and pray. At supper time, when your sister is about to serve dinner and you really ought to be helping her out in the kitchen, but you're not. All of these things really are unexpected encounters, nothing out of order, except for meeting God at the crossroads in life. Theologian Frederick Buechner, who's a wonderful writer, called our attention to this when he said, Jesus is apt to come in the very midst of life, at its most real and inescapable moments, not in a blaze of unearthly light, not in the midst of a sermon, not in the throes of some kind of religious daydream, but at supper time or walking on a road. He never approached from on high, but always in the midst of people, in the midst of real life, and in the midst of the questions that real life asks. I know from time to time when someone has lost somebody very dear to them, and I've been asked at that point, will they ever receive a sign from that person that their loved one's okay or not? And very often the person in grief will share with me that they've been staying up night after night so they won't miss the sign. And every time I try to explain that the sign they seek will come not when they're looking for it, but when least expected, just as Jesus likes to show up for us. Always in the midst of real life and the questions we ask. When we stop demanding to see the hand of God, that's when undeniable truth will visit us. These readings today are about one thing: faith. What does that concept mean? Faith. It means I believe. I've followed and listened to Jesus, and above all other teachers, I believe in Jesus and his pathway. It doesn't mean I believe so I can get something out of it. I have a Disciples of Christ colleague who's quite interesting. He's a pastor, but he's also on the autism spectrum. So when he started out as a pastor, he wondered, because his perceptions were different, if he would be enough for his congregation. Would he be enough? He kept asking, am I enough? And like many other Americans, we think that if something is good, more of it's going to be better. But as Reverend David says, that's what you're seeing in today's gospel, where the disciples have decided that to do the things that they have to do, they need more faith. And they ask Jesus to give it to them. Actually, they demand it, and that's kind of a weird way to go after Jesus. And as Reverend Dave says, like us, the disciples tend to think that more is better. If they could only have a bit more faith, then everything would be right as rain. They have seen what Jesus has done, making blind people see, removing leprosy from the skin of people, casting out demons, feeding 5,000 people with a few fish and little bread, and so much more. How do you live up to that? They realize that there's no way that they can do what he did with their puny faith. If they want to even do 10% of what Jesus did, they will need an extra strength of faith. So that's the world we live in. More is always better. But Jesus counters this by telling the disciples that to move a mountain, you only need faith the size of a mustard seed. It's not about having enough faith. Being faithful is doing what God would have us do in the world, even when we think our faith is incomplete. God doesn't need us to believe enough. God needs us and calls us to be faithful, to seek to do God's work in the world. It's about trusting in God's faithfulness, even when our faith is wavering. Jesus brings up something that is falling out of favor these days, a sense of duty. A sense of duty. Jesus is talking about doing what you're called to do with no fanfare, even if it might cost you. By the way, when we do something out of duty, we do so without expecting any reward. This was especially important in this gospel scene because a group of Pharisees was listening to what you all just listened to. And they believed, some of them believed, that God, they lived the letter of the law, and they believed that if they did that God was going to give them special favors in this life, a kind of a spiritual quid pro quo. I believe that this kind of spiritual payoff is exactly what we find and is popular in some Christian evangelical churches. It's called the prosperity gospel. That theory motivates people to do good for an earthly reward. God blesses those God favors with material wealth. That's the prosperity gospel. From this has come, if you think about it, a whole generation of pastors driving Rolls Royces and flying Learjets while the wallets of their people are getting thinner and thinner. What's missing is a sense of duty out of love of God. Jesus calls us to do what we're called to do, plain and simple, without receiving applause or special consideration. We are called to be servants to one another, and what God demands of us is duty. I ran into a story the other day it happened to be about Florida too. A man named John Meade was a homeless veteran down there who had no family left. And he was loved by the people on the street, though, because he was always kind and he was doing things for people. And when he died, there was no family. No one left to mourn. But the veterans in St. Augustine, where he lived, would not let John go without a funeral with full military honors. Dozens of vets came to pay their respects, including fellow veterans from across Florida. As the vice chairman of the Veterans Council said, we knew little of John's life, but we know that his days in St. Augustine touched the lives of many. We're here today, he said at the funeral, because we represent John's family. That's what duty looks like. And it grows out of mutual service. But how does that mustard seed of faith stand up against all the woes and evils that we're faced with today? Mass shootings, Christian nationalism, racism, and mental health crises. The mission may seem too large for us individuals our individual servants of Jesus, even with the mustard seed we're told we have. What we need to do, Jesus tells us, is to keep going and realize that we can perform one duty that Jesus mentions that is perhaps the hardest thing that God ever asks of us: forgiving people, even when their actions require forgiveness again and again and again. Jesus often shows up in those intimate moments between servant and sinner. Many years ago, and not here, I was summoned to the home of a church member who, while always generous with the church, was known for his many prejudices against people of color, against Jews, against many minorities, anybody who didn't look like him. He also wasn't fond of women pastors, by the way. That evening with him ended up being nearly 3 hours long. I sat at his kitchen table as he told me everything he had done in his life from the time he was a teenager, including all of his accomplishments and how, in the process of being hurt multiple times, he lost the ability to trust people. And then buried deep in this 90-year-old story of his life was one quick, tiny sentence that described how 70 years before he arranged for the death of an enemy. It was the most complete and yet unrepentant confession of a long life that I had ever received. About a year later, I was called to the hospital by his caregivers. The family had long since abandoned him because he had been admitted and he was dying. Perhaps within 3 months, he would die, they said. I had brought communion with me, which is what I usually do when I come to the hospital, as you know, when I come to the hospital here. And when I offered it to him, he shouted, no! He couldn't take communion. And when I pressed him about why, he began to sob deeply and loudly. He said to me, I've been a horrible person all most of my life. I've done so many angry things to people who hurt me. I couldn't trust anyone. So I reminded him that it wasn't too late, that no matter how many wrong things that he had done, if he were truly sorry for them and asked God's forgiveness, God would deliver him from his sins. So he lay there. We said the Lord's Prayer together. I said a prayer of confession and assured him of God's pardon. And then he received communion for the first time in 50 years. The bread of heaven. A kind of peace descended upon him, and I felt at this supper time that Jesus had just walked through the room and healed us both. He died in hospice 2 months later, with his family by his side, the ones he had long ago driven away, now back to love him. God promises this. God promises this. And in the letter to Hebrews in the Bible, we hear God speaking, and God says, this is the covenant I will establish with the people of Israel, declares the Lord. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people, because they all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. I will remember their sins no more. the cup of salvation. Amen. I send you forth in these southern winds out there right now that are blowing up, come all the way up from the Gulf. Just reminds us that there really are no boundaries in this globe of ours, and there shouldn't be any boundaries between us. So let's take our mustard seeds out and find a good place to plant them in someone's heart that needs uplifting, in some guy at school who's being bullied, in some elderly lady who's living alone and has no one, and maybe even in ourselves because we haven't forgiven ourselves. May God bless you and keep you all this week. May God make God's light shine upon you and enlighten you and lead you to the people who need your love and help the most. Amen.